The sun had just set behind the mountains, leaving streaks of orange and red across the sky. I was sitting in a small cafe in the city center, skimming through some contracts when my phone vibrated. The caller ID flashed on the screen. Frank Carter. I frowned. Since my mother passed away, I had kept my distance from Frank, the man she had married just a few years before her death. He was never really a father to me. Just a gambler, a man who lived off my mother. Reluctantly, I answered the call. "Jack, what a great day, isn't it?" Frank's voice rang out, unusually cheerful. I responded coldly, "What do you want?" "Oh, it's just a small thing," he drawled. "I just wanted to share some good news. I sold your cabin in the mountains." I shot up from my seat, feeling as if someone had just punched me in the gut. "What?" I shouted. Frank chuckled. "Calm down, Jack. It was just an old cabin. You never even used it. I sold it to pay off some debts. Consider it a favor to both of us." My grip on the phone tightened, my knuckles turning white. "You had no right to do that," I growled. Frank sighed, his tone turning bored. "Come on, Jack. Do you really think that cabin was worth anything? You should be thanking me for handling the problem. The buyer has already paid, and they're coming to take possession tomorrow morning. If you want, I could give you a small cut, but I think it's best if you just forget about it." I stood there, speechless. That cabin wasn't just a piece of property. It was the only legacy my mother left behind. It was the place where I grew up, where she and I shared the happiest years of our lives. And now, it had been sold off like a worthless trinket to pay off gambling debts. Memories flooded back. As a child, I spent every summer at that cabin with my mother. We spent entire days picking wild berries, cooking together on the old stove, and when night fell, she would tell me fairy tales by the fireplace. She always said, "This house is a place you can return to whenever the world feels too heavy." But now, I had nowhere left to go back to. I couldn't let this happen. The midnight drive to the mountain. Without hesitation, I rushed to my car and drove 3 straight hours to the cabin. The road up the mountain wasn't easy. Sharp turns, dense trees casting eerie shadows across the pavement. Tonight felt darker than usual, as if the universe itself was warning me of something ominous. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, pressing harder on the gas. "Mom, I won't let them take this house," I whispered to myself. When I finally arrived, the sight before me made my breath catch. The cabin still stood there, silent in the darkness of the old forest. But something was off. As I stepped inside, a sharp chill ran down my spine. The front door was unlocked, even though I clearly remembered locking it the last time I was here. I switched on my flashlight, sweeping the beam across the room. The furniture was still in place, but something felt off. The bookshelf in the living room was slightly tilted, as if someone had been searching behind it. Wooden floorboards near the kitchen had been pried up, revealing a small hidden space underneath. On the table, a cup of coffee still had steam rising from it. Someone had been here. I pulled out my phone to call the police. No signal. My heartbeat quickened. Someone is looking for something. But what? And why? Discovering the hidden secret. Then I remembered something. My mother once told me that she had a secret hidden in this house. Something only I could find. But back then, I was too young to understand. I started searching through the cabin, determined to find any clue she had left behind. When I pushed the kitchen chair aside, my flashlight reflected off a strange scratch on the wooden floor. My stomach tightened. I knelt down and carefully pried up the floorboards with a knife. And there it was, an old wooden box sealed tightly with a red wax stamp. I broke the seal and opened it. Inside was a stack of aged documents, yellowed by time. I picked them up, my hands trembling as I realized what they were. The original land ownership papers. Not just for the cabin, but for 100 acres of land surrounding it. My breath caught in my throat as I absorbed the truth. Frank thought he had only sold a rundown cabin, but in reality, he had just unknowingly given away a multi-million-dollar property. I sat frozen in the cabin, my flashlight illuminating the stack of documents in my hands. Each word on the paper burned into my mind. 100 acres. Not just the cabin, but the entire surrounding land had belonged to my mother. And now, it was legally mine. Frank thought he had only sold an old, worthless cabin. But in reality, he had just thrown away a multi-million-dollar estate. He had no idea. But a more pressing question haunted me. Why had my mother hidden these documents? The wind howled through the trees outside. I closed the box, deciding to get some rest and deal with everything in the morning. But as I climbed the stairs to the bedroom, creak, a footstep. My heart pounded. I turned my head toward the living room. Nothing. Maybe I was just on edge, imagining things. And then, creak. Another step. I wasn't imagining it. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and slowly descended the stairs. The air felt colder. I turned toward the kitchen. A shadow darted past. Someone was inside. I pressed myself against the wall, switching off my flashlight to stay hidden. A tall figure stood in the middle of the living room, dressed in a dark coat. He was searching for something. His hands rifled through drawers, overturned chairs, his eyes scanning the room as if he knew exactly what he was looking for. He was searching for the documents. But how did he know about them? My pulse raced. I clenched my phone, trying to call the police. No signal. Damn it. I had to act fast. If he found the documents first, everything would be lost. I scanned the room for something, anything I could use as a weapon. Near the fireplace, I spotted an iron rod. Carefully, I picked it up. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out from my hiding place. "Looking for something?" I asked. The man jerked around, startled. Under the moonlight streaming through the window, I saw his face clearly, a middle-aged man with sharp, calculating eyes. He wasn't afraid of being caught. On the contrary, he smirked. "So you're Jack." His voice was low and rough. I held my ground, refusing to show any fear. "Who are you?" I tightened my grip on the iron rod. He took a step closer. "The buyer of this house." "But it seems you're not ready to hand it over." The buyer, Frank, had sold the house to him. But it wasn't just a rundown cabin, it was land worth millions. Anger flared inside me. Frank tricked you. He had no right to sell this land. The man raised an eyebrow. "Oh, is that so?" He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. Seconds later, an image appeared. My breath caught. It was a photo of my mother standing next to Frank. But something about the picture sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't a happy moment. It wasn't a casual snapshot. She stood stiffly, arms crossed her face, tense as if she had been forced to take the picture. "When was this taken?" I asked, my throat tightening. The man smirked. 5 years ago, a few months before she passed." Shock flooded through me. "That's impossible. My mother would never take a photo with Frank." He shrugged. "You really think your mother wanted to marry Frank?" His words froze me in place. I had never questioned it before. But now, as I pieced everything together, my mother despised Frank. Yet she married him. Why? What leverage did he have over her? I swallowed hard, feeling my world collapse around me. Frank wasn't just a gambling addict. He was hiding something much bigger. And the man standing before me knew the truth. "Jack, I have no problem with you," he said, tilting his head. "But if you want to keep this house, you'll be facing people far more dangerous than me." My heart clenched. Outside, thunder rumbled, signaling an approaching storm. The wind howled, shaking the cabin as if trying to tear it apart. I stared at the man before me. "What are you saying? What do you mean?" He smirked, his eyes never leaving mine. "Your mother didn't marry Frank out of love, Jack. She was forced to." I froze. "Forced? What do you mean?" He pulled an old folder from his coat and tossed it onto the table. I opened it and felt my entire body go numb. Inside was a loan contract. $500,000. Creditor, Frank Miller. Debtor, Eleanor Carter, my mother. "No, this can't be," I whispered, my world crumbling around me. Frank had controlled my mother with a massive debt. I turned to the next page. A second photo appeared. My mother stood next to an unfamiliar man, fear evident in her eyes. Behind them was a large sign, Carter and Smith Investment Company. I examined the man closely. He looked familiar. Then my breath caught in my throat. It was my biological father. My heart pounded. Why is my father in these documents? My voice shook as I looked up. The man across from me furrowed his brows. Jack, you really don't know, do you? He pulled out another set of papers. I flipped through them. Evidence proving that my father once owned this entire land. But he had mysteriously disappeared, leaving everything to my mother. 1 year later, my mother married Frank. A wave of dizziness hit me. All these years, I had been living a lie. Frank wasn't just a gambler, the man said. He orchestrated everything. He pulled out his phone and played a recording. A familiar voice filled the air. Frank's voice. I told you, that woman thought she could escape me? If she doesn't sign the papers, I'll make her life a living hell. Shock coursed through me. Frank had forced my mother into marriage to steal this land. But the worst part was yet to come. Do you know what really happened to your father? The man asked. I swallowed hard. He disappeared in a plane crash. The man let out a dry chuckle. Are you sure it was an accident? I couldn't breathe. My fists clenched tightly. Frank destroyed my family. He pushed my mother into desperation. He may have even killed my father. And now, he was trying to sell what rightfully belonged to me. I need to find Frank, I said, my voice filled with hatred. The man in front of me nodded. I can help you, but are you ready to face the truth? I had no other choice. I nodded. Then let's go. We found Frank at an underground casino. When I walked in, he was drinking, laughing with a few strangers. Jack, my dear nephew, came looking for me? He laughed loudly. I threw the documents onto the table. My mother never owed you anything. You forced her into this. Frank froze for a moment, but then he smirked. So what? She's dead now. And you're just a clueless kid. I pulled out my phone and played the recording of his voice. Frank's face turned pale. The people around him stopped talking and stared. Where did you get that? He shouted. I looked at him calmly. The police will love to hear this. Panic flashed across his face. He turned and tried to run, but this time, he couldn't escape. Police officers swarmed in, arresting Frank on the spot. I stood still, watching as they handcuffed him and dragged him away. Finally, the nightmare was over. 2 months later, I officially reclaimed the entire property. I restored the cabin, making it a home once again. While cleaning, I found my mother's journal where she had recorded everything. The truth she had always wanted me to know but had been too afraid to reveal. I placed the journal on the table, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. At last, I understood how much my mother had loved me. Frank was sentenced to 20 years in prison for fraud and forgery. I stepped out of the shadows of my past, ready to start a new life. Lessons to remember. The truth will always come to light. No matter how long it's hidden, the light of truth will always prevail. Never trust a liar. If something doesn't feel right, dig deeper. Family isn't always trustworthy. Sometimes those closest to you are the ones who betray you the most. Justice comes, but you must fight for it. If I hadn't investigated, Frank's crimes would have remained buried forever. Be strong and protect what's yours. If I had given up, I would have let evil win. What do you think about this story? If you were Jack, would you have dared to confront Frank? Do you believe justice always prevails? Have you ever been betrayed by someone you trusted? Share your thoughts in the comments.